titles, but local titles with high corporate margins. So this is not that newspapers are folding because they can't afford to exist. They're folding because they can't deliver the high level of shareholder value that they've been used to. Secondly, the collapse of newspaper profitability from the mid-2000s with the migration of advertising online and that loss of classified advertising, which was clearly a pivotal development for local newspapers. And there's no clear reason that they should get that revenue back. Classified advertisers have in effect gone from subsidizing publishing to really making Google and Facebook ever more profitable. And those two causes really need to be distinguished. The first shows that simply boosting the profitability of publicly traded commercial newspapers may not lead to good investment in journalism. And I think that's really key. This is not just about buoying up these news organisations, because that buoying up doesn't necessarily go into good journalism. Quite the reverse, it just goes into enhancing profit margins. Good journalism is very rarely the winner when high profit is the intent. And the second, in particular, the story about the migration of advertising underlines one of the rationalities and key kind of policy changes that we'd like to see within the MRC of having a levy on the likes of Facebook and Google, which could actually begin to supplement and fund journalism, where you've got very clear requirements on what that journalism is that you would be subsidizing. In other words, journalism that is not for profit and is in the public interest. Now, just as it's clear that there's a relationship between journalism and democracy, so it's equally clear that certain types of news publishing are capable of doing precisely the opposite. So they're capable of undermining public debate, misinforming citizens, and failing to hold power to account. The webs of institutional corruption that were exposed by the Leveson inquiry back in 2012 extended far beyond that kind of, the phone hacking scandal, and still serve as a very compelling reminder that systems of self-regulation that we exist with now, especially when they don't cohere to essential criteria of independence and effectiveness, which was set out in the Leveson recommendations, offer no guarantee actually of an independent journalism of integrity. If you remember back to Leveson, we had 4 successive prime ministers giving evidence to that inquiry, that saying that they got too close to media owners. And they get too close to media owners because they think it matters in terms of their ability to win elections. So if they can muster favour with newspaper owners, they may well get a decent coverage, and that may help them win the election. Now, countless research has shown it's not quite as simple as that, but it doesn't matter. The fact that these politicians think it might have some influence is all that needs to happen for them to actually then refuse to do anything that will interfere in the running of those news organisations. Last year, research that was done by the organisation Hacked Off, that I also am part of, found that Rupert Murdoch and his senior executives met with senior ministers and officials over 200 times in just 24 months. Now, that's an incredible level of entanglement between media elites and political elites. And so it's no real surprise, actually, that kind of post-Leveson and continuing, we are seeing a real decline in journalism's authority and legitimacy. And that general decline in trust, public trust in our news organisations, is worse in the UK than it is in pretty much any other country in Europe and any other institution. In 2020, the Edelman Trust Barometer said that trust in the media in the UK had fallen to 35% amongst the general population, down from 37% in 2019, and it plummeted to an all-time low of 31% after the last general election. And when a general election campaign is underway, and I'm sure lots of us will be talking about this later in the evening. But what you see at play is that relationship between media and democracy in very close quarters. In the general election in 2019, research undertaken by Loughborough University noted a lack of balance in media coverage between political parties that far exceeded the levels that we had in 2017, which were pretty bad. The BBC came under particular criticism in that election. Ofcom received 2,124 complaints in relation to the total broadcast coverage of the general election 2019, compared to only 427 complaints in 2015 and 635 in 2017. I should say they upheld only one of those complaints. And that has not got to do with the fact that those complaints weren't legitimate. That has got something to do with the process of making complaints and the criteria for complaint making within Ofcom. And of course, I'm sure we'll talk about this evening, the fact that Paul Dacre is been now widely touted as the next chair of Ofcom, Paul Dacre being the former editor of the Daily Mail. And rumour has it that they can't find an independent member of the Appointments Committee who's willing to endorse that appointment at the moment, which is why they delay. That is a rumour, but but you can imagine just how much influence and impact that will have actually on all the discourse around impartiality and what impartiality might mean, particularly in an election period. So despite the claims of journalism to be an institution that supports and strengthens democracy, it's really often found guilty of doing precisely the opposite. Forms of journalism that prey on the vulnerable and are discriminatory. There were over 8,124 complaints to IPSO, which is the main body that regulates the majority of mainstream newspapers, largely run by people in that newspaper industry, so hardly independent. Of those complaints on discrimination, again, only one of those complaints was upheld. So you can see, there are all sorts of problems. It's clearly not a system that's functioning well. And so rather than the journalism who are on a noble crusade for truth and justice, again, because of those commercial pressures, it's too frequently replaced by gossip and spectacle, forms of journalism wholly committed really to market practices, driven by a desire to ensure profit, rather than those difficult practices involved in free expression, political participation, and democratic renewal. Now, I want to talk briefly to end around the issue of concentration of media ownership, because in the Media Reform Coalition, we think this is absolutely key and related directly to a decrease in news media's legitimacy. The UK has a supposedly competitive newspaper market, but only 3 companies control 83% of daily news circulation. And those 3 companies help to set the agenda for the rest of the entire news media. So, legacy media, legacy press may have lost the trust of the nation, but they've certainly not lost the ability to influence the public conversation and the conduct, actually, of the entire rest of the media. Research on the agenda-setting influence of those right-wing newspapers on broadcast news coverage of the 2015 general election in the UK and the coverage of the European Union referendum points to the continuing ability of those voices to distort conversations about contemporary politics. And in the general election 2019, we saw unprecedented levels of misinformation, obfuscation, bias across most mainstream media. The Conservatives, if you remember, and this goes wider and across social media, but can you remember the Conservatives changed their Twitter account to look like a fact-checking service? We had the government refusing actually to be interviewed by certain journalists, and of course the case where Johnson hid a reporter's phone in his pocket so that he didn't have to look at the picture of the young boy on the hospital floor. But more importantly, maybe the study of Loughborough University, again, there showed just how, although there was balance in terms of the amount of coverage for Labour and Conservatives, they were overwhelmingly negative about the Labour Party. And of course, we have to remember in that context that the Conservatives were elected on a mandate to drop the second stage of the Leveson inquiry and to repeal Section 40 of the Crime and Courts Act, which was the final and integral part of the Royal Charter Framework of Press Regulation that was agreed by a cross-party consensus in Parliament. In 2018, I'm just going to take you up to where we are now, but in 2018, the Competition and Markets Authority advised the government against allowing Rupert Murdoch to gain control over Sky News. And in that announcement, they cited threats to the public interest over media plurality. And Ofcom acknowledged what they called disturbing evidence of corporate failure within the Murdoch empire. But and of course he was refused at that moment, and the MRC played a really big role in making sure he wasn't able to gain that control over Sky News. But of course he's now invested in a new UK television news channel. He's been granted a license to broadcast by Ofcom, and he's now about to enter the UK television market effectively via the back door. And I think that move exposes the reality that Britain's current media ownership rules are not fit for purpose. They're simply inadequate. Actually, the previous Tory government agreed with that. They endorsed a recommendation by Ofcom at the time and a House of Lords Select Committee to carry out periodic reviews of media plurality to ensure that the news media landscape is sufficiently diverse and democratic, but nothing happened. And repeatedly, this issue is kicked into the long grass. And so we're now in a context where Murdoch is being allowed to gain a further foothold on the UK media. So the MRC are joining a call to ask for a parliamentary commission of inquiry on media ownership. We're calling on Parliament to act rather than the government, because we know that governments are influenced very much by media owners. And we're calling for an independent commission because in granting Murdoch the green light, we think that Ofcom has failed in its statutory duty to ensure fit and proper broadcast licenses. We think, you know, if we can't do that, then we really are in a very difficult position. But we also know that this debate is going on across the world. And in Australia as well, they're now trying to work, trying to campaign very hard against the Murdoch takeover of public life, essentially. So maybe I will end there and pass over to the next people, but I hope that's given you a good backdrop for the issues.
Thanks very much for that, Natalie, and I'm sure we'll come back and explore some of those issues further in the conversation. I'm really pleased that you actually mentioned the role of the media in the 2019 general election, because you know, there's been much written and much said, both inside and outside the Labour Party, about the role of the media in 2019 and 2017 for that matter as well. But there's no doubt in my mind, and I speak as a journalist myself, and I'm actually ashamed by actually some of what I read during the course of that, you know, election, which was basically parroting lies that were basically uttered by the Conservative Party in particular, but also other people who should know better as well. And I think it really speaks to the challenge that we have when we do have a media that actually willfully actually broadcasts lies. So, you know, I mean, maybe that's something we could pick up in the conversation. I posted a link in the chat as well to a very good review of media bias in the 2019 general election from the Truth Defence Organisation. And I think it was released a couple of weeks ago, and it's well worth a read. But for the moment, Natalie, thanks very much for that. Our next speaker is Tom Mills. Now, a little while ago, a few years ago, Tom wrote this fantastic book, The BBC, The Myth of a Public Service. And I thought I knew quite a lot about the BBC, but reading Tom's book was a real eye-opener. Tom is also an academic. I believe he works out of Aston University and has been a campaigner for democratising the media for many, many years. Tom will talk about the BBC and some of his observations of media bias and where it comes from. So Tom, over to you.
Hello, hi everyone. Thanks for having me. I probably should have mentioned I'm also vice chair of the Media Reform Coalition with Natalie. So we've got a good tag team going here on different aspects of the media. So Natalie's given loads of context on in terms of the broader sort of political economy of the private media, the increasing concentrations of ownership, and the various kind of responses that we're working on at the Media Reform Coalition. The aspect that I wanted to talk about is a separate bit of work that we're currently undertaking, which is actually led by Natalie, which is thinking about how we could reinvent public media for the 21st century. Now, why do we need to reinvent public media? Well, because if we start from not the BBC as we like to imagine it, but the BBC as it actually exists, then we realise that the BBC falls short. And this isn't just an accident, and it's not just an opinion of mine. If anything, I would say like the BBC is a hugely over-researched institution. All I did with my book was I combined some research that I conducted, which was looking at the changing culture at the BBC after Thatcher. I also looked at the BBC in the 1970s, but I never actually ended up publishing from that. And then I combined that with lots of other research that had been conducted over the years. Not necessarily critical research, just researchers by a sort of mainstream social scientists looking at the BBC's content, very middle of the road historians looking at how the BBC has reported routine political issues and how the BBC has handled moments of particular crisis. So we know a lot about the BBC, but what's unusual about the BBC is that, like, unlike some other institutions, nobody in British public life seems to be capable of having a rational conversation that's rooted in the evidence of what we know about this institution. So what I'm going to do rather quickly is give you a bit of an overview of that, but then sort of fast forward to how I think we should address that and why I think this is an important issue. Now, when I started talking about the BBC and researching the BBC over 10 years ago, this was sometimes a difficult conversation to have on the left, because the left has always had to kind of navigate this difficult terrain in defending the BBC as a public institution against those, you know, overtly misleading and politically partisan forces that really have polluted British public life, and trying to defend the BBC as a kind of island of rationality and professional reporting. And I think, you know, a lot of that is all well and good. Now, the problem with it is that as the BBC's, like, first of all, there's central problems with the BBC, which we see throughout its history and really go back to its origins, but particularly in the neoliberal period. So with the rise of Thatcherism, what we've seen is this gradual erosion of the BBC, where the more public aspects of what the BBC does, in other words, the parts of the BBC that lives up to some degree to this promise, which the central promise of the BBC, which is being independent of the state and being independent of markets. Now, that's never been true, right? But it has been more true. And what's happened as the BBC has been continually attacked from the right is it's been drawn towards this sort of, first of all, a less independence. It's never been independent, it's become less independent, but it's also been more integrated into the market. Now, over time, particularly as we've had right-wing governments, that's pulled the BBC further to the right. Now, after we talked about the 2019 general election a little bit, specific data from the Reuters Institute, specifically on the BBC, found that the percentage of people trusting the BBC in 2020 had dropped down to 60% from 75%. So that was presumably as a direct result of that general election. That's an extraordinary decline in trust, actually, and that brings people who identify with the left down to similar levels that you see people on the right who are basically just continually wound up about the BBC by, you know, outlets like the Telegraph and the Press and the Daily Mail and the rest of it. So there's been a decline in trust on the left. That decline in trust, I think, is a perfectly legitimate response to the way the BBC has conducted itself since 2015 in particular. And what I want to try and do is give you a sort of understanding of how the BBC is orientated towards the Labour Party. Now, I don't think the BBC is quite biased against the Labour Party. I don't think the data really tells us that. The BBC, if there's a bias, I don't particularly like that word, is biased against the interests that the Labour Party occasionally represents and claims to represent. In other words, the BBC is biased against the Socialist Party. Well, why is that? There's two very basic and straightforward reasons. Number one, the BBC has never been independent of the state. This is a claim that is made from its beginnings, but the historical record is very clear on this. And we can actually see, if we look at the institution, that this isn't the case. We recently saw the chair of the BBC appointed by the government, Richard Sharp, who's a former director of the Centre for Policy Studies, which, for people who don't know, is a think tank which sort of launched Thatcherism into the Conservative Party and is aligned to the hard right of the party. He's also donated over £400,000 over the years to the Conservative Party and appears to be a strong donor of far-right causes. So they have these kinds of mechanisms in place where they can put people at the top of the BBC who are politically aligned to the government. The government can also set the rate of the license fee, and there's this sort of thing that you'll see circulating on Twitter around defunding the BBC. Well, defunding the BBC has been government policy since George Osborne was Chancellor. It's been a deliberate attempt to further curtail the BBC's lack of independence in combination with the constant threat of being able to renew the charter and appoint people to the board. These are all very straightforward and uncontroversial limitations to the BBC's capacity for independence, which then shapes the BBC's broader political culture. Now, in combination with that, you have the fact that there's a very hierarchical managerial and editorial structure at the BBC, which is connected to that political, that sort of high culture at the BBC of a highly politicized environment. That was all intensified in the aftermath of Thatcherism. Now, I don't have enough time to give you a sort of a long history of the BBC. Usually I talk about the general strike and tell you how ridiculous the whole notion of BBC independence is on the basis of that. But I'm going to fast forward slightly to what happened after Thatcherism, because I think it's useful in understanding how we got the BBC that we have today. Now, the conventional story that you get from this from Gene Seaton, who was produced official histories of the BBC, is that Thatcher wanted to privatise the BBC, and there was a bit of a hoo-ha, and everyone got a bit worried. But ultimately, you know, British pragmatism won out, and public broadcasting was saved, and everyone was happy. Now, what actually happened was there was a process of intense marketisation at the BBC, which was informed by neoliberal managerial principles, was explicitly imposed on the BBC by John Birt, who was Director General during the 1990s. Now, I recently was in a debate with David Dimbleby about this, who dismissed the very idea that John Birt could possibly be a neoliberal. And the reason no one else knows this is basically because no one bothered reading John Birt's autobiography. It was one of these things that came out, and like John Birt was incredibly unpopular. Well, he says it very clearly what his politics are in there if you actually read it. He says he wants to marketise the BBC. He says he wants to curtail union power. He says he doesn't believe in state spending, and so on and so on. It's basically a Thatcherite tract. Now, what he did was he came in, he marketised the BBC, and a lot of the programmes you see now on the BBC are actually come from the private sector. So the BBC was integrated into the market. Managerial control was strongly imposed on an organisation that had grown very quickly, and in a sense, and absorbed some of the more sort of critical journalistic culture that was around then, and was actually probably stronger in places like the ITV companies, which were more independent. So the BBC was producing good journalism around that time, and as a result of various sort of conflicts with government, the culture changed. Now, fast forwarding a long way to today, what we find now is a BBC which has always been very close to the British state, including the secret state, including MI5, MI6, and all of the rest of it, and all these various institutions that we would describe as the establishment, but also become much, much more pro-business in a very, very explicit programme to change the BBC's internal culture. Labour correspondents disappeared, and they were replaced by business correspondents. You know, this is where Robert Peston came from. This is what launched him as a sort of journalistic star in the aftermath of the 2008 crisis. The BBC's political culture was explicitly shifted in a pro-market direction. So we end up, by the time Corbyn becomes leader of the Labour Party with the leftward shift of our party, with an organisation which is basically very close to the British state, very close to the British security establishment. How would we expect that institution to respond to an anti-imperialist leader of the Labour Party? We have an organisation which is absolutely embedded, as I show in my book, in neoliberal pro-market policies. How would we expect an institution like that to respond to a political party which has assumed an anti-austerity position? So this is what laid the groundwork at the BBC and the structures that give rise to its reporting. And what we end up with basically is a BBC that even the very conventional research shows, has moved to the right under the Conservative government. And I don't think that will come as a surprise to anybody. The Director General, who's recently was appointed, Tim Davie, is himself a former Conservative. He used to run the commercial side of the BBC. Tony Hall intensified the commercial initiatives that were introduced by Bert. What do we do about this? Now, what we're trying to do at the Media Reform Coalition is to develop a vision for a different type of BBC, because if we're always on the back foot and we're always defending the BBC as it is, basically we reach a point where there's nothing worth defending. We won't be able to mobilise behind it, but it will be taken away from us piece by piece. So what we need is a defence of the BBC on the principles that the BBC claims, but then start to think about how could we create a BBC with different sorts of structures, different sorts of relationship to the British state, a different sort of relationship to the viewers and listeners that's supposed to represent. So that's what we're trying to do. I have some ideas. Number one, we can get rid of all forms of state control. We can create a BBC that's democratically accountable to people and not to the government, right? That's one thing. We need a much more devolved institution. We can't have an institution that's centered on London and where all of the centers of social power are, and then expect it to be able to hold those people and the class of people around them to account. We can't expect it to represent different parts of the UK and the north of England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland in any effective way if that's the shape of this institution and it's mapped onto the institutions of the British state. So what I've been arguing for at the Media Reform Coalition is a vision of public media which would be, think of the BBC as a democratic public platform, not as a broadcaster, but as a digital public media platform, which is answerable to the public and not to the government. And finally, because I've talked for too long, an important part of that is a response to the situation with big tech, because this is something that Natalie touched on as well, that we're very concerned to integrate into some of our advocacy around media. We have to respond to the concentrated power of the so-called legacy media, some of the deep problems in our public media, but also the very serious rising power of big tech. And that has to be about levies, it has to be about trying to redistribute wealth, but it also has to be about developing public alternatives. So I will leave it there.
Thanks very much for that, for that, Tom, and also for that sort of vision of what the BBC could actually be, if only we could actually get to a point where we could actually do that. And I think some of the points that you raised about the history of the BBC, obviously time doesn't permit us to go into all of that in detail, but I've already plugged your book and I can't recommend it highly enough. People should get a hold of it and get their eyes opened in relation to that. And it was really good to hear you mention about big tech as well, because what's really interesting and particularly close to our hearts, all Labour Party people at the moment, is the local elections are obviously, well, at the minute they're still going to go ahead according to what the government has said. Clearly there'll be no canvassing, or very little, because of the coronavirus situation. So more than ever, Facebook and other platforms will be absolutely crucial in getting the message across. And we know what the Tories did and shadowy organisations in the background in the general election, and I fully expect similar things to be going on. Maybe not on the same scale because it's a local election, but we'll see something similar going forward. I'm absolutely convinced of it. And the whole area of Facebook and what we do about those parts of the media that seem to avoid, in some cases, scrutiny is, I think, a very, very important issue, and one that I think we'll undoubtedly talk about later on this evening. Anyway, time to move on to our next speaker. And the next speaker we have is Helen Watson, who is Head of Communications at the National Education Union. Now, people will be aware that the NEU has been very high profile during the recent discussions, shall we say, with the government around schooling, and has, if you like, seen, I suppose, what it's like at the sharp end of the of how the media operates. But she's seen it from both sides, because I mentioned earlier, Helen is also a journalist by trade, but is obviously someone who works within the media environment, and has also worked as a trade union and Labour Party activist, trying to influence the media as well. So I'm sure she'll have some reflections on what she's seen from the media, both in the recent period and perhaps elsewhere as well. So Helen, it's your turn next. Over to you.
Okay, thanks, Andy, for that introduction. I just need to say that my son is practicing the euphonium in the room next door. So if you hear lots of noises that sound like dogs farting or something like that, it is my son. One is euphonium and not me or the dog, because we haven't got one. So anyway, thank you very much for inviting me to speak. I've kind of here with two hats on, really. So as Andy said, in my day job, I'm head of communications for the National Education Union, but also I am currently chair of Chingford and Woodford Green Constituency Labour Party, which is the seat of the lovely Ian Duncan Smith. And it's quite nice to have this kind of cultural exchange with Northwest Durham, because you kindly lent us Laura in 2019 to launch our election campaign. And whilst we ultimately didn't manage to defeat him, she kicked off our campaign with really fantastic style. So thank you very much for that. She was great. So I've kind of experienced the issue of media bias in my job, and also obviously as a campaigner in my own community. But I think the pandemic has found us in quite unprecedented times. It seems sort of quite inconceivable that the general election that we were talking about and all the issues that were thrown up in it was only just a little over a year ago, because it actually feels like a lifetime when you think about it. I think coronavirus has changed society and the world we live in ways which we're only just beginning to really understand and comprehend. And I think most profoundly, that's probably played out within education. So since March last year, when the first lockdown was announced, in education, we've seen schools closed to all but key workers and vulnerable children. Educators have steered our young people through the exams debacle in the summer. They've pioneered remote learning with technology that really more than a year ago didn't exist. I mean, you know, who knew that the most uttered word in people's houses would be "you're on mute" even a year ago. Educators have coped with introducing COVID security in education buildings over the summer break, many of which were never designed for any social distancing at all to be possible. And then bringing it up to the current times, when transmissions rates shot up as much as they did at the beginning of the year, then we've campaigned for schools to be included in the lockdown in January to keep our members and communities safe. So this year, I think, has been a bit of a roller coaster, dealing and adapting to sort of the inept and contradictory advice from the government. You know, the way we've had to react to policy made on the hoof or at the last minute, whilst at the same time concentrating on the safety of our members and the communities they live and work in, and how to provide at the same time the best education we can to children. So I'm very proud, I think, of the work that our members have done. I'm very proud of our union. I'm very proud of the people who work for our union, because I think their hard work and their perseverance and their dedication has made a real difference to the way society is progressing through the pandemic. But I think in some sections of the media, that's really not the story that has been told. And I think the most important thing to say about it is that that's made our job a lot harder. So from the first lockdown in March, you had some parts of the media have really helped the government narrative and try and deflected attention from their sort of the government's weak policy making, their bad decisions, the last minute U-turns really, by diverting it to and criticising educators, it diverts the blame from the government. So you'll be familiar with a lot of the arguments. So when we raise the issue of our members' safety, there are opinion pieces in the newspapers saying, you know, what makes educators so special? Why shouldn't they go into school and college? And why can't they work like all the other key workers, like our NHS heroes that we clap for on the doorstep, or the posties, or the delivery drivers, or the supermarket workers? What makes educators so special? And then the argument that children don't get coronavirus. That was the first, in the beginning of March, that was firstly what experts were saying. And then that children don't get sick with it. So, and how much being out of school damages children, while at the same time not really addressing or acknowledging that children are part of families and they're part of communities. And so therefore the things that happen to them happen to all of us. You know, we had Daily Mail journalists listening into Zoom calls with our workplace reps. We had 5 stories printed in the Mail attacking our union in 1 week. In the Daily Mail last year, they printed, don't know if any of you, I've got the link, I might put it in the chat later, which is like a rogues gallery of prominent NEU staff, where they sat and picked apart what people did in their private lives and where they lived and what their houses, what the inside of their houses looked like. And just in the past week alone, you know, we've had a piece in the Telegraph where it was insinuated that that the union is using the pandemic to push for a pay rise. And that was picked up in the Daily Mail, and it was used on the Jeremy Vine show. It sort of escalated into now educators are insisting on a pay rise before they even go back into school. And a negative story that was printed in the Mail on Sunday this week generated a tweet by Andrew Neil, which received 20,000 likes and retweets from all sorts of Tory MPs and Conservative commentators, which basically said that even if educators get vaccinated, we oppose schools being reopened. And so this narrative goes on. And I think from a union point of view, through the pandemic, what's been really important to us is to be clear and to make sure that everything we could do to stand up for our members, the children they teach and the communities they serve was done at the right time. So in June last year, we produced our first education recovery plan, which was a kind of roadmap for the government to set out what they needed to do to make schools safe to reopen after the summer break. I mean, we sent that to Boris Johnson and we didn't even receive a reply. In it, we furthered the idea of things like Nightingale classrooms to spread out, to make the class sizes smaller, to reduce transmission. You know, discussed the idea of a recovery curriculum where, you know, children were taught, were tested about what they did know, not tested on what they hadn't managed to be taught because they weren't in schools. We discussed PPE in schools and things like a programme to address mental health issues that children might have. And then just before Christmas, obviously, we campaigned for schools to be included in the lockdown. And more crucially, between New Year's Day and the day that was set aside in most areas for schools to reopen, we launched a campaign to follow the science. So, you know, we thought it important to say that while children don't get very ill with coronavirus, they do contract it and they do spread it. And they do spread it to their families and to their communities. And that is why that even when educators are vaccinated, schools might not return to normal straight away because all of our families won't be vaccinated. And the vaccines themselves won't stop transmission of this virus in society. So as a trade union, it's our job to represent our members and to keep them safe. But what we've been doing during this time has gone beyond that. And we had to campaign hard for schools to be included in the lockdown because without schools being included, it just simply wouldn't have worked. You know, at the beginning of the year, the highest infection rate was amongst secondary school children, closely followed by primary school children. Then the next band was their parents. So our members work in the kind of environments where socially distancing is sometimes quite impossible, where you've got children who are travelling into school on public transport, where members can't wear PPE because they are teaching, and what they do with their hands and their face matters quite a lot. Schools went from being completely safe one minute, you know, the day before schools were due to reopen, Boris Johnson said, oh yeah, you know, schools are completely safe. And then 24 hours later, suddenly they were vectors of transmission and had to be closed. So I think what's important for us is that we listen to the scientists, we listen to the doctors, the A&E professionals who were saying that the NHS was on the verge of collapse due to the rate of COVID transmission in communities. And our members took all this information, listened to the experts, matched it with their lived experience and what they know was happening, and used health and safety legislation to inform their employers that they believe schools were unsafe working environments to return to after the Christmas break. And I think their action was quite brave, but what it did would force a U-turn, help to force a U-turn at any rate from the government. And schools and colleges remain closed at the moment, except for the children of key workers and the vulnerable. And our members are teaching children remotely. So since January, our union has built and launched a remote learning hub, which I'll put all the links afterwards in the chat when I've stopped speaking, which has been used to develop and share teaching resources to make sure that kids get a really good education when they're at home. We've updated our education recovery plan, which really sets out what needs to be done now if schools are to be reopened in March, as the government say. How to make them safe, what needs to happen to education and the curriculum, and also how we need to tackle poverty and disadvantage, which has spiraled massively in the pandemic. We've launched a Help a Child to Learn campaign, which with the Daily Mirror, which has given £1 million of our own money, which we've done, which we've basically savings from things like not being able to hold our conference face to face and also training events. And we have donated that to provide vouchers to the most disadvantaged schools so they can distribute basic stationery to children learning at home whose parents can't afford it. You know, we've spoke to our members, you've got children doing their homework on pieces of toilet roll, or they're saving cereal packets to write on the inside. They don't have, the only thing they've got in the house is a biro. You know, not to mention no access to laptops or to broadband, you know, people completing homework on their mother's phone and not being able to send it because their mum's run out of data. You know, these are not stories that you are going to be reading when you pick up a newspaper or watch TV. And the reason that I've outlined all the stuff that educators see is because I think it really suits the narrative of some in the media to say, to fly in the face of real life and provide this kind of story to back up a government that's failed in many of the challenges that society, that has been thrown up in society by the pandemic. Saying all that, I think actually the majority of parents and the publics just don't buy it. And I think that a lot of people don't believe the hype that is going on around the pandemic and around education. I think people's lived experience tells them that their children's schools are doing a really good job. I think anybody who's home educated their kids suddenly realises how fantastic teachers are, because by, you know, all my friends who've got little kids, by 12:30, they want to go on the wine, you know. They see that schools are running food banks, that schools are sending meals to children in their homes, that they are financing parcels of pens and paper so that children can learn at home. They're fundraising for laptops, they're getting dongles, they're, you know, doing their best to get children to go online. They also see their, you know, the parents of children in special schools and in early years settings still see that through this current lockdown, those schools have been open to all children. And I think that most people know that school staff aren't slackers, that we don't want special treatment, and that people are working really hard to do the best they can for the children they teach. and they're going above and beyond to try and make sure that education for pupils is disrupted as little as possible. When Gavin Williamson asked parents to report poor teaching to Ofsted, you know, poor remote learnings at Ofsted, Ofsted was overwhelmed with emails from families praising their child teachers and their schools and education being provided. I think there was something like 5,000 emails that went to Ofsted saying how brilliant schools were coping. And I think people's lived experience is telling them a different story from the one that they read in some of the newspapers and that they see on the TV. And the reason I raise that is because I think ultimately it undermines the credibility of those media outlets that kind of perpetuate this narrative that really differs with what readers and viewers know to be true. I mean, Reuters did a recent study on how traditional media outlets are losing credibility and value amongst their audience in favour of things like social media and alternative online media sources like Novara and things like that. And I'm going to put the link in the chat because it's really interesting, because it shows that actually since the 2019 general election, when there was so many untruths perpetuated by the media, that many traditional newspapers are losing their credibility, and people are ceasing to believe them as somewhere where you can get proper news and, you know, truthful information on what's going on in society. And I think ultimately these people are undermining their own base, their financial model, which I think is really important, and also their viability in a world where people don't really need to buy the Daily Mail or the Telegraph or the Sun. They can find out their news from their phone and they don't necessarily need to engage. I think ultimately by being attacked for defending your members for a trade union, that's a kind of weird reverse compliment. You know, we've tried our best to defend our members, the children they teach, and the communities that we work in, and that is not anything that people should be ashamed about. And I think we will continue through this, regardless of what happens in the media or what people say. We'll continue to do what we think is right to ensure that we do the best for the people that we represent going forward. So I'm going to put links in the chat to that report and also to our education recovery plan. Thanks very much for inviting me.
Helen, thanks very much indeed. And on behalf of everyone in tonight's meeting and also everyone in North West Durham Labour, thank you for everything that you do and your colleagues do in the National Education Union. I think it particularly struck me what you said there about people realising, if they didn't do already, because I'm sure many of us do, the fantastic role that teachers actually do provide, and particularly when people have had to do some homeschooling, you know, clearly they actually see that. And, you know, more power to your unions, Elbow, and all the other teaching unions for taking on the government and exposing them for some of the stuff that they've actually come out with during the course of this crisis, and the demonisation of teachers that we've seen in the likes of the Daily Mail and elsewhere. You know, you're basically in good company when it comes to people in the labour movement who've actually been demonised by the biased press and media that we have. So for the moment, thanks very much indeed for that, and look forward to seeing those links in the chat. And I've put one of them in there myself to your appeal with the Daily Mirror as well, so people can support that. Also, just to say as well, to remind people that we are taking donations ourselves this evening for a cause that's actually quite adjacent to the ones that you've just been speaking about there. Emma, our fundraiser, mentioned earlier about the emergency appeal that we've had from a local school for some mental health packs. So people can donate, and I've just seen the details of the CLP bank account going back in the chat there. Anyway, our final speaker this evening, I think it's fair to say, is someone who is no stranger to working in the eye of a media storm. James Schneider, former spokesperson and director of strategic comms for Jeremy Corbyn, will have experienced quite a lot of that during the course of his work for Labour's former leader. And I think it's fair to say as well, he's probably experienced firsthand the role that the media plays in distorting not only Labour's message, but also rubbishing its leading representatives. And I, for one, am really looking forward to James's observations this evening. And I know he's got some very strong views and firm views as well on media reform. And I saw a particularly interesting snippet, I think it was on Double Down News quite recently, where James was highlighting some of his thoughts on this area. So James, over to you.
Thank you, Andy, and thank you everyone for being here and for the three brilliant speakers beforehand. So we all know that the media is neither neutral nor particularly free. If we didn't know that because we'd signed up to an event called Media Bias, we've heard three brilliant contributions that lay it out really well. But the secret is that actually most people already agree with you. Okay, all right. I mean, some people don't. There are some journalists and probably most newspaper columnists, and also those those political academics that you see on Twitter who have like poll prof something as their Twitter bio. Like they probably think that the media is really free and it seeks truth and it exposes power and it challenges it and all of that jazz. But as Natalie laid out, the trust in our media is extremely low. People basically think it's crap because it doesn't pursue decent news values, and people can see that. But nevertheless, it's still incredibly powerful at shaping public attitudes, and we see that on issue after issue. Of course, we saw that in attitudes towards the Labour Party. What's quite just one bit of evidence that shows that in both 2017 and 2019, in the election campaigns, public attitudes towards the Conservative Party and the Labour Party changed dramatically in both elections. Basically, they go like that. Because of the change in broadcasting rules, there's more balance in TV broadcasting, although it was different between 2017 and 2019, which I'll come on to. And that shows the power of the media in shaping public attitudes with how it presents things. And it's like, particularly strong with moral panics. So take like George Osborne's scrounger, strivers and scroungers in order to support cuts to social security. There was a 2013 poll that found that the British public thought that a quarter of the social security budget was lost in fraud, when the truth was something like 0.7%. Now, that was something that was constructed as a moral panic, very, very effective, changed public attitudes, and took real concerted effort, in this case by the leadership of the Labour Party after 2015, to push that back. So the fact that the media isn't trusted doesn't mean that it isn't powerful. Now we're all here because I imagine that we want to change the world and we want to reorder it fundamentally for the many, not the few, and that means that we that socialists can't afford to not engage with the media because it's such a powerful organ for communication, or to treat it fatalistically, like it's the weather, like it's something that simply can't be changed, like, oh, well, of course the mainstream media or whatever is going to attack us and there's nothing that we can do about it. Really, we have to see the media as a really significant site of struggle itself, that the media is like a field of human activity that builds, reproduces, and can also change the established order. And different bits of it do different things. So Tom's focus is on the BBC, which has this kind of, at least in my experience, has like a very big status quo bias. It tries to reproduce the existing order of things, and that's why you see it very much attacked for being biased by both the left and the right. It's why the Leave campaign and Leave voters and Brexit supporters thought that they weren't being represented, because for quite a long time actually they weren't either, because the BBC generally supports this kind of liberal pro-market status quo. And it's important in this struggle, the struggle within the media, to see it as an active, not a static force. It's not this unchanging monolith that just acts upon us. It's changing all the time. It's got its own challenges to its business models, and they're opening available to all those that want to change the established order in whatever direction, in progressive directions, in regressive directions. There are openings. And we've seen a lot of this in the last decade, and you can call them hacks or openings, but my main point is that they don't last forever. They're these temporary ways, tactical maneuvers that you can have that give you openings to operate in the media. So a few examples with different political valences. So like in the Arab Spring in Tunisia, in Egypt in particular, social media played a really vital role in getting news out and organizing around the established media, which was mainly controlled by the state. But now these platforms, Facebook and Twitter, are much harder to use for political organizing and mass organizing. The impact of Facebook, Facebook changing its policies could be seen dramatically in the 2017 general election and the aftermath. I mean, Facebook's algorithm in the summer of 2017 was accidentally brilliant for us. Accidentally, they weren't trying to do it, but basically helped news stories from whatever platform go viral. And while printed press in 2017 was hugely, slanted towards the Tories, content on social media, what was shared on social media, was hugely in our direction. I think that's more democratic and has more legitimacy than the Tories one, because we were shaping it. But really, it's very stark, and it was outsized to our levels of support. And for some periods of time, some publications were able to build their business model on that. So The Independent, for example, did incredibly in that general election. Its readership figures were through the roof. And actually our strategy as the party and as Corbyn's team was that we would get the Indie to do a straight write-up of whatever our policy story was of the day, for the many, not the few, whatever it was, free car parking, scrap car parking charges, or free school meals, or scrap tuition fees, or whatever it was. And then it would be that article that got shared dramatically. But also it was the same thing for different alternative media sites. The Canary and Evolve also had these huge explosions of their readership in 2017. But then Facebook changed their algorithm, and they always can. They changed their algorithm, nothing to do with the UK, because they were coming under pressure because of the role that Facebook played in the 2016 US presidential elections. And now Facebook have also come out and said that they're even going to further downgrade political content, so on people's news feeds. And Zuckerberg said something like, people don't want to see politics or news when they're chatting to their friends, and so it's going to become less useful as a place for us. It's still useful, but we'll have to look at different platforms for viral videos. I mean, one of the big marks of both the 2017 and the 2019 general election campaigns, I think, was the impressive number of viral videos produced by Jeremy's team and by Momentum that hugely got outside of political bubbles. Something like 2/3 of voters with Facebook accounts in Sheffield Hallam saw a Momentum video in the last week of the 2017 general election campaign. I mean, this was real forms of mass communication. And even though they changed their algorithm in 2019, we were able to still do much better than we were in 2017. But we know this is based on essentially a platform that we don't control, an algorithm of which we can't see, and a multi-billion pound private corporation for which we have no accountability. But still, there's an openness there sometimes. In both general election campaigns, we benefited from broadcast impartiality rules, which at least give Labour relatively equal time. But even these things are not static and change, and we need to be aware of. So in 2019, they gave us coverage, but the coverage of us was more negative. That, according to academic studies, was more negative than that of the Tories. And also the Tories themselves have worked out better how to deal with the kind of claim and counterclaim presentation of balance. So rather than the broadcast of the media having to work out what's actually true, or to put claims from two sides in context. They just say Labour say X, the Tories say Y, with no balancing of what it was. So, for example, Labour had we had the leaked trade documents with the UK-US post-Brexit trade deal talks, which showed an enormous threat to the NHS, but also all sorts of other things, and the potential of £500 million a week going out of the NHS in higher drug prices. And it demonstrably showed that the NHS was on the table in these trade talks. Now, the presentation from the BBC and other broadcasters was Labour claim that it shows it's on the table. The Tories say this is nonsense, which, you know, the Tories have worked out how to deal with neutrality, where they turn stories that are negative about them into a he said, she said, rather than there being any semi sort of objective basis. And anyway, we shouldn't rest on the idea that we're going to get decent application of broadcast rules, because we hear that Boris Johnson wants to appoint the Daily Mail's group editor-in-chief, Paul Dacre, to head up the regulator. So these openings, they come, but also they can go. Moving politics in a different direction, Donald Trump, who's, you know, probably the standout political communicator of the era. I don't mean for good, but he's technically very impressive, hijacked the 2016 US presidential election through generating controversy, through saying wild things and dangerous things on his Twitter account, which led to coverage of him, which was hugely disproportionate to the level of support of his candidacy, which was calculated at being worth $5 billion in basically free advertising, which was more than all basically all the other candidates for both Democratic and Republican primary campaigns put together. But we also know that even though he used those accounts very well and generated controversy, and we could maybe try to copy some of those things, his accounts have been closed down across all platforms. And of course, we all hate Donald Trump, so some people might cheer, but before we do, all this could very easily happen to socialist leaders. And in fact, it has happened to socialist leaders in other countries. For example, in Ecuador, former President Rafael Correa had his Facebook accounts shut down and has been victimized there. And we can start to see that same thing happening again. New methods will open up, and already are. The Bolsonaro campaign in Brazil for the hard right used WhatsApp incredibly effectively, WhatsApp messages in their election. The organization that I'm part of, Progressive International, we just had a observer mission in Ecuador's elections last week. And the big thing there is that a lot of the election campaign took place on TikTok. And this completely took people by surprise. And two candidates in particular, one came from totally nowhere to come forth, basically with a TikTok campaign, and one who might have come second and therefore might have got into the runoff used TikTok very effectively. So, what I'm saying is that socialists need to be tactically nimble within the media to respond to threats and to take advantage of opportunities. But we need a lot more than tactics. The terrain is constantly changing. It provides opportunities, but we need much more. So if we're going to have a strategy to change the media, to engage with it as a field of struggle, I would argue there are three strategic postures we have to adopt, and then apply them across three different models of change, three different types of change that need to come together to deliver a kind of comprehensive socialist media strategy. So the first strategic posture, the first thing that socialists should try to do within the media, is to seek out controversy. We live in an attention economy. Controversy means that something will jump from one platform to another. It can be reported in different things. What you want is to be spoken about, and your opponent to attack you, and therefore more people are going to hear what you're talking about. An example: the 2017 Labour manifesto being leaked. Now, we thought it was sabotage, and whoever did it thought that they were sabotaging us, but really it was fantastic because it was wonderful controversy. Oh my goodness, the manifesto has been leaked, and look what's in it. There's all of this stuff that we were told was completely bonkers, and actually the overwhelming majority of people basically just wanted all of the, wanted to have higher taxes on the rich and better public services and some public ownership of some basic utilities. But how do we do that now? How do we build controversy now to capture attention? And I think the main thing that we can do is to build movements. We can see that in the UK, for example, Extinction Rebellion and Fridays for Future in 2019 got huge media attention for their issue by building their movement, actively taking part in direct action and all the rest of it, which means that radiophonians have to talk about them. They become the subject of conversation for newspaper columnists, on TV, and so on. And we can see this from country after country, where the media environment is so much worse than ours. Take several Latin American countries, where still you have phenomenal and impressive victories for really quite progressive political parties and movements. And in large part, that's based in the fact that they have powerful social movements, powerful labor movements that are able to generate their own attention from like a broad mass of the population. The second is to develop our own narrative against the billionaire-owned and influenced media, and so that every time that we're attacked, every time the National Education Union is attacked, anytime basically anybody who's remotely pro-human is attacked, that's because they are standing with the many and the media oligarchs are standing with the few. The fact that you are being attacked is evidence that you're on the right side. Use the lack of trust that the public have in the media against themselves. We manage to do this sometimes with Jeremy, but not sufficiently consistently. But I think we need to build that the whole way through. And then the third strategic posture I'd say is like a both and. We both build new media, Novara, Double Down News, Tribune, etc., but we're also active within existing media. We can't walk off the pitch. We can't not be involved. We can't allow the leaders of our movement to not be having our say, and not have people trying to go into those media organizations and try to open up space for progressive and socialist things within them. So we should do everything that we can as individuals and within our own organizations to support alternative media organizations, but we also need to pressure the people that we have that can go on the media to make sure that they are doing that, and to provide as much support for them to do it as possible. Because if you walk off the pitch, if you're only hearing one side of the argument, politics will continue to shift to the right. And that's what we're likely to see in the media landscape anyway, with the arrival of GB News and News UK, Rupert Murdoch's venture, which Natalie was speaking about earlier. And then I think we apply these three strategic postures to three different types of change. Like there's interstitial change, like change that can happen in the cracks, things that you can do in the here and now, random little openings. So that might be getting more movement people and socialists into corporate media, onto broadcast media, to have better systems for clipping and sharing them on social media to build up their arguments, to try to get hybrid media moments, and also to build alternative media, but always trying to do one of those three things that I said, always trying to build into one of those three strategies: seek controversy, develop the narrative against the media and for a media for the many, not the few, and building up our capacities in the media, because otherwise those little things can feel like a bit like a drop in the ocean. The second thing is evolutionary change. So that's changing the media both from within and from without through small actions that can build up. So we need to build up our capacity to act. That there are great organizations that help people get onto the media like Neon, but there are also things that we can do in putting in complaints, supporting the Media Reform Coalition and other campaigns. And also we need to build our own institutions, our own media institutions that can help shift the balance of power within the media itself, especially within the BBC, but also give us a platform for us to build the movement, educate ourselves and train ourselves. But the thing with the evolutionary change is you can be co-opted. So we have to always be careful to resist co-option. That means very strongly sticking to the idea of having controversy, and very much to this, everything having this narrative, which is extremely critical of the media and using its attacks on us as a weapon against itself. And then the third is like big change, ruptural change. And that's the only thing, those are the sorts of things that we can basically only really do in government. So in order to do that, we need to build the policies that would create radical change, more radical democratization within the kind of media and communications landscape. Tom laid out a lot of that. Tom and his colleagues have some wonderful, brilliant policy suggestions. Some of them came together in Jeremy had a speech in 2018 at the Edinburgh Festival. I might put a link to that in the chat, which brings some of those together. But we need to work to build up both the policies, the political demands, so that people in the country want that and that's attractive when it's brought forward in an election. And then we also have to campaign in the party to make it so. You know, motions to conference, motions within our CLPs, so that we adopt much better positions on media democracy. Because I mean, actually, the 2019 manifesto was quite limited in this regard, and much more limited than that speech that Jeremy gave that I referred to. So I'll stop in a second. There's I've gone on probably way too long, but basically in short, there's loads that we can do. There's loads that we have to do. The media is not something that just happens to us. It's not something to just be upset about. Jello Biafra, lead singer of the Dead Kennedys, has a wonderful phrase, which is "Don't hate the media, be the media." And I think we can do that in all sorts of different ways within the existing, building the new, and in a way that can expand the zone of journalism that seeks truth and challenges power, rather than what we have now, where the majority of it fundamentally hides truth and props up power. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much indeed, James, for that. And, for your observations and thoughts on, what is an issue that you rightly said, no Labour Party member, no socialist can actually ignore. We've actually got to engage with the media, even though it can seem quite difficult, it can seem quite challenging, and sometimes you can feel a little bit grubby at the end of it as well. But I think, we have to be on that pitch, as you pointed out. I'm going to try and get to some of the questions. So we might we will run beyond 9 o'clock, but I think hopefully we can get to some of the questions. If I can ask the recipients of the questions, i.e. our panelists, when I ask you them, if you can be as brief as possible. And I want to just put this first one in the first instance to Natalie, because obviously a lot of what's been spoken about tonight is about campaigning for change. How do we actually best campaign for change? We've got, there's the alternative media that people will be familiar with, Double Down News, Novara. James himself mentioned the likes of Tribune. We've obviously got the Morning Star as well, that has a different take on the news. But these platforms are never seen beyond their own sort of area. So how can they move out from their base of supporters? How can we make that happen? Your thoughts on that, Natalie, and I'll come to Tom next after that.
Yeah, I mean, picking up on much of what James has said, really, is if we're going to create a movement for media reform, which is really what we need, that puts media reform as important to our democracy as other aspects, as education and healthcare. Really, if we don't have a media that feeds democracy, then we are always going to be deeply impoverished in how democracy functions. And for me, that does come down to three main issues. The first is stopping that concentration of media ownership. So what we've got at the moment are very dominant, very powerful players, which frees out an awful lot of other discourse and narratives. And they do that online as well as offline. So I'm aware, of course, that there are, you can get any view you want online, but actually if you look at the concentration of the way messages travel and flow online, you still get those legacy media dominating all of that news content that is read. So when you we now look at combined print and online reach. And when you look at that, you still get the dominance actually of the Sun and the Daily Mail, mostly. So, you know, we have a real problem and we have to stop. So we have to campaign and keep the pressure up for new plurality reviews and regulation, which will prevent that from happening. So that's number one. The second, which comes back to some of what James was saying in his both his interstitial and his the kind of next stage, is we've got to promote independent media, and we've got to find ways of sustaining independent media. At the moment, a lot of that is done on a shoestring. It's really hard to keep it going. It's very difficult for journalists to work for independent outlets and actually, you know, put food on the table. So we need independent media that is well financed and functions in a democratic way. So there are lots of new news outlets now which are pro-union, which are, you know, operating in a cooperative manner, and are very much changing the model of commercial kind of profit-oriented commercial platforms, really, and trying to do something quite different. We've had a massive flourishing of independent media, and we need to do all we can to support that, and also to include it in our understanding of what a public media ecology can be. And that comes down to the final point, which is having a really diverse, independent and universal public media. And that's not just the BBC. That we need to think beyond the BBC and extend our understanding of public media to a range of different outfits that fit those criteria that are in the public interest. And I think if we do that, then we will come much closer to having a media environment that actually can sustain democracy. And we can campaign on those levels. We've got 2027. The BBC has, its review is coming up now. It's a key crunch point for the BBC. What we don't want is for them to withdraw all public funding from public service media. That would be a disaster. What we do want is a democratically reformed public media system. So we need to make sure that our political parties are adopting these as key policies and don't ditch them as they run into a general election because they're just too risky and they're worried about media coverage that they'll get. We need to be campaigning on them locally and supporting our independent media as best we can. And we please do sign. The Peace and Social Justice Project is running a petition for this Parliamentary Commission on Media Ownership. So we've all got to get behind that and make it a massive concern that can't be ignored.
Thanks for that, Natalie. Tom, just for you, and apologies for making it about the BBC again, but you know, how are we able to defend, if you like, the BBC from piecemeal privatisation that we know has gone on historically, and also the threat of defunding it, while at the same time attacking the BBC for, you know, its outright bias at times? I know you don't necessarily like the term, but for its, I suppose, it's almost refusal not to report the news, if I can put it like that. How do we straddle both sides of that particular horse, as it were?
Yeah, I mean, I think really in the way that you described, I think people worry too much about this idea that somehow if you criticise the BBC, that's going to empower the sorts of interests which threaten the BBC's long-term future. I mean, this is nonsense. Like, Murdoch and the Tories don't sit around thinking, oh, I really hope that lots of left-wing people offer a critique of the BBC's relationship with the establishment, because that will advance their economic interests. I think, you know, liberals in particular have been far too jumpy and hysterical on this issue. The threat to the BBC is serious, but it's a long-term threat. I mean, if you look at some of the coverage that was going on around the appointment of Dominic Cummings, there was this sort of sense that somehow he was going to just destroy the BBC through the sheer power of his hostility. Now, anybody with any sober analysis, and that unfortunately doesn't include most people who write for The Guardian, knew that the BBC's status was secure until 2027. The problems with the BBC were long-standing problems of being defunded by the government, on which there had been considerable continuity. If the left doesn't have that critique of the BBC, which has to be based on the defence of public broadcasting, and I think it's worth saying, by the way, that we're all very politically engaged people on this call. There are things about the BBC that people like, and there are good things that the BBC does. I mean, the BBC doesn't have the absolutely atrocious journalistic standards that you see for the Daily Mail, for example. Generally speaking, if something's reported on the BBC, unless it's about the left of the Labour Party, it will almost always be true, because they take those professional standards very seriously, and it's only on very small number of issues where they completely junk any kind of professional standards. So what the left needs a critique of the BBC, precisely because otherwise you leave the field open to the kinds of critique which gets mobilized by the right, and it becomes quite effective. And I mean, James alluded to some of this in terms of the right's relationship to the BBC. There's two things that I agree with a lot of what he said. There's two things that go on. Number one, yes, the BBC has tended to not reflect some of that like right-wing populist fervor, let's say. But the other thing that has been going on is that the BBC's ability to sort of reach out, the BBC has always had the sense that it's removed from the population, and that's because it is. If you look at the people who run the BBC, they all went to Oxford, they all went to private school, they all travel in the same sort of circles as the politicians, right? And so that you can look at the Social Mobility Commission, which is the government's official sort of body for looking at the sort of makeup of the establishment. The BBC is very similar to a lot of the other institutions of the British establishment. I mean, I don't think there's any sort of controversy about that, right? If you don't have that critique from the left, all that it does is it leaves the field open to the right to critique the BBC. Now that's bad, because that means the BBC people have a sort of somewhat distorted view of the BBC. It's also bad because it pulls the BBC further to the right. The way that the BBC basically responded to this sense of feeling alienated from the population was to say, oh well, we need to be less liberal, less metropolitan, and more sort of Nigel Farage and Daily Mail-y, and that's what people generally want, right? So you can see what kind of political impact this has on a left movement where the left case isn't made. So actually, I think an anti-establishment critique of the BBC that takes the principles that the BBC claims to uphold is essential, not only for developing a different vision of the BBC, but also dealing, I hope I'm making sense here, dealing with some ways that the BBC thinks about itself, and some of the ammunition that we basically then hand to the right in terms of pushing the BBC's reporting even further. Because the BBC's always treated the right-wing media as basically legitimate political actors, and at worst really a sort of proxy for what your man on the street thinks about X, Y, or Z. And this is the big problem, I think. So sorry, that's a very long-winded way of saying I just think we should just straightforwardly talk about the BBC as it is, and talk about the problems, and try and take the BBC at face value in terms of what it claims to do. You can, by the way, have some successes with the BBC, not through the official complaints process, but if you do actually complain to journalists and point out when they violate professional standards, that is the best way to get some kind of response. Now, as other people have said, the complaints process is very, very poor, but there's a reason why the BBC website has better journalistic standards than BBC broadcast. It's basically because they produce ridiculous headlines, and then people point out how ridiculous they are, and then they change them within the space of about 4 minutes or so. But when your average sort of Laura Kuenssberg goes on TV and people start shouting at her on Twitter, that obviously doesn't make any difference. So we can see there are, James talked about openings, and there are those openings at the BBC as well.
Thanks for that, Tom. If I could just ask Helen for her sort of observations on that, both in terms of maybe not so much concentrate on the BBC, but maybe reflecting on, newspapers like The Guardian, for example, which historically, and I'm exaggerating here for effect, but has always been seen as, if you like, left of centre-ish, and yet. I think there's a lot of things that people, in our party would take issue with with the Guardian for, and some of the standards of its reporting. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, sorry, I'm getting trolled by my family because there's been 5 goals in the FA Cup for Tottenham Everton, and we're losing. So anyway, if I get loads of little ringing noises, you know where that is. On a personal, if I was talking not doing as my job, but as a, you know, as somebody who came into journalism from a working class family. I mean, my dad drove a bus, my mum worked in a shop. I left school when I was 16. I went into journalism through an apprenticeship, and I was probably, because I'm old, I was probably the last sort of generation of people that actually did that. And I think quite a lot, what is absent amongst a lot of journalists and the sort of view that you get in papers like The Guardian is that they represent a certain class of people that can afford to be journalists. So when I came in to journalism, you know, it was still okay for working class, you know, we earned very little money, but it was still a sort of route that working class people could come into journalism. And now I think because of the salaries that journalists get paid on local newspapers, which are ridiculously low, they can get more money than working in Tesco's and they can working on a local paper, and they work 40, 45-hour weeks. It attracts people that have to be supported by their parents or have to come from a community where there is a certain level of income, because otherwise they couldn't exist. And so therefore I think they reflect the viewpoint of their own conditions. That's what people do. They reflect their own outlook. And I think because of that, it's very hard to get sort of balanced reporting where people see things from somebody else's point of view, because they all come from the same pool. And you know, I remember I used to work for NewsQuest, which is one of these hideous sort of big companies that own massive amounts of local newspapers. And I remember training somebody who was asking me where I did my journalism degree. And I said, I haven't got a degree. I didn't go to university. I did an apprenticeship. And he had come from Cambridge. And he said, how can you be training me then? And I had to say to him, well, because I'm better at it than you are, really. Even though you've got a good education, I appear to be a lot better at it. But I think that he just said what is the case, that a lot of people, if they come from that, you know, you look at the class composition of journalists on The Sun. The people who work on The Sun, I know lots of people that work on The Sun, they've all been to Cambridge, they've all been to Oxford. It's not working class people telling, you know, speaking to other working class people about what they like to read and what they like to think and what they like to see. It is people who come from a different background than them completely. And I think it plays into this idea that, you know, the new media that's coming out, the reason I think it's so important is because it's much more diverse and it reflects people's opinions, their experience of life, their lived experience. And therefore, that's why it's really important. I mean, you know, Andy and I could sit and drink lots of gin and bang the table and shout about The Guardian. But I think that they have, you know, in the general election, they proved that they are representing a certain type of person. And that wasn't people who would necessarily be Labour supporters.
And an awful lot of those independent media are set up with the precise ambition to be diverse and representative. And so they're beginning from that position, which and that makes a huge difference. I mean, I couldn't agree more, Helen. It's getting worse in national media, I think, than better, because they offer up internships all the time, and that's the way to get on. And you cannot afford to live in London or work with an internship unless you've got massive family backing. So, you know, what we are getting is a very, very narrow sector of society representing our national conversation back to us. And, you know, that really is shocking. And that is where something like public service media should be able to counter that. And that, you know, it's appalling that we have a BBC that is so, you know, operates in such elite sections of society, essentially. And that, you know, that should be something that is possible to change. It really should be.
Thanks for that, Natalie. I'm going to ask just James to come back on. I mean, obviously, you were at the sharp end doing the job that you did. You must have been intensely frustrated at, you know, some of the distortions that you saw on a regular basis, particularly during the elections. How did you actually, on the one hand, keep going back for more, if you like, or if I can put it that way, but how did you try and actually just get some kind of recourse on some of the rubbish that was reported? How did you avoid being so, frustrated, really, I suppose?
Well, I learned how to absorb an enormous amount of stress and not sleep very much, and be in conflict for sort of 18 hours a day, waking up at 6 and starting rowing and through the rest of the day. It's not really a very healthy lifestyle. It took quite a long time to recover afterwards. It's a weird thing because sometimes you can have a brilliant day, like a brilliantly successful day, and what that brilliant successful day of 18 hours of arguing and cajoling and rowing and briefing and all the rest of it can just be that nothing happens, right? Like there just isn't a story. There isn't a story. I mean, there are so many bad stories that didn't run for whatever reason. But you've got no, there's no way of the outside world knowing, like, job well done. We didn't get brutalized today. And I suppose that can be a little bit exhausting. I mean, going back to what you do in response, I mean, okay, yeah, sure, you try to insert small rebuttals and try to insert a few facts and ridicule the absurdities and don't accept the premise of your opponent's argument, etc., etc., etc. I mean, these are all the small things you can do, which you have to do, and of course, we try to do as much as possible. But I mean, really, the big thing is, do you find space for your own narrative? Do you find space for your own story? And that's more important than small level rebuttals. On basically every. I mean, I think that everything to do with political comms, you need to zoom out as far as you can to the level at which most people are going to be engaging with it, which is totally in passing. And what does the story or the conflict within the story or the story about the story, what is that telling them? Because that's really the level on which you're communicating and need to always be aware of, rather than the micro. Of course, you need to get into the micro, but always aware of how that looks. Just want to say one thing about the Guardian as it came up, because it's I've got a theory, but I'm not sure. Because it's one of the big things. Why did the Guardian move to the right at the same time as the political terrain in the country moved to the left? And there's like contingency agency arguments, like the editor changed, and maybe Kath Viner's just like a kind of Neil Kinnock figure who people thought came from the left, but then shifted the party to the party or the paper towards the right. Maybe this just happens with random swings. Maybe it's to do with the old versus young within the paper. I mean, basically everyone who's my age and below who works in the Guardian is on not everyone, but most of them are on crap contracts and not permanent and threat of the sack all the time. And then all the people who are twice my age have gold-plated, fantastic deals, and no one can get rid of them. Some of which have been negotiated by Seamus Milne when he was the NUJ, who was in the NUJ, the paper at the time. But I've got this other possible theory, which is, and this speaks to my point about evolution and not being co-opted and seeing the limits of evolutionary strategies within institutions. The Guardian is a liberal institution. It's not a socialist institution. It's never going to be a socialist institution. At the time when it was a useful safety valve, there was loads of left-wing stuff in it as the minority. Like, that's where you could get the progressive stuff when there was no one who could actually make it happen. They were pro-Palestine 10 years ago when it didn't matter. Then when you get the chance of having a prime minister that would immediately recognize the Palestinian state, then suddenly the editorial line has to change. Likewise, on a whole, I mean, that's one example, but on a whole range of issues. So I think, conceivably there's a kind of return to the mean from a liberal institution that has sort of progressive outside layer, that the outside layer pulls back, because it really is quite phenomenal. I mean, look at the coverage of the Assange trial, for example. In The Guardian, it's basically crickets over a story that they drove 10 years ago. The coverage of of all of that, it's like the MI5 stamping on their hard drives in their basement had sort of profound psychological impact on the entire organization that now stretches up from the basement in, all the way through to the top. Anyway, random thought.
Thanks. I'm going to finish off on a question and try and get the answer into this question, if you can, Tom, because we do have to wrap things up. Apart from anything else, Helen will kill me if she doesn't see any Spurs goals this evening. And so you're coming between Helen and the inevitable FA Cup defeat, potentially. I don't know. I was really struck earlier in the meeting when I think it was Natalie who mentioned it, that this is a very, very important issue for the Labour movement. It's almost as important as NHS, as education, because it's so crucial to what we're actually trying to do. And I want to mix that up with a question that was thrown into the chat earlier on. Is it so important because media impartiality, if we can call it that, does it pose a threat to our democracy unless we get a better media? Is it that serious, which is why we've got to fight really hard to actually, to completely, almost not reform the media, but transform the media? And if everyone can answer that, and then I'll sum up tonight, and we'll go with you first, Tom, because you're on screen.
Okay, yeah, well, I mean, the simple answer is yes. I mean, democracy is sort of a continuum, isn't it? And if we want to make the society more democratic, then it simply can't, that's not going to happen if you have like a very concentrated social power in these institutions, which are fundamentally, to one extent or another, opposed to the interests that the Labour Party and socialists represent. So, I do not think that fundamentally you will be able to transform society if in the same part of that you're not able to transform the institutions of society in the way that James has spoken about, but also as a movement, if you're just not going to have the kind of potency or capacities if you don't have your own source of infrastructure. So I think James laid out a very good sort of, I don't know what to call it, sort of topology or like different sets of strategies that you need. But one of the good things I think that has come out in the last few years is that people are increasingly recognizing that any project for social transformation has to have this issue at its core.
Okay, thanks for that. Natalie, your comments on that, just to wind things up.
Yeah, well, it won't surprise you at all that I entirely agree with Tom as Vice Chair of the Media Reform Coalition. But I think coming back to what James said earlier as well, is that actually an awful lot of people agree with it now, and that's the real difference. So I think even 5 years ago, this was not something that on the doorstep people would have said, yeah, this is crucial. If we don't change this, we're doomed. I think now there's a real moment where people are recognizing that our media landscape is not fit for purpose and is not doing democracy any favors whatsoever. And people are feeling that democratic demise daily. So I think the moment is now. And we all really need to get behind this now, not least because there's not likely to be a general election for a few years. And so now is a really good moment to make sure that the media reform movement takes hold before we get into that panic pre-election period where political parties suddenly want to, garner favour with all sorts of media organisations. Now is the moment to build that movement. And there is a real gathering of momentum behind it.
Thanks, Natalie. James, briefly, very briefly, causes for optimism on this issue.
Yeah, I think that we're everyone here. We're socialists who want to transform society, and one of the many things that we've learned in the last 5 years is that, you know, just because we get elected to some positions and we put forward some ideas and those ideas are generally popular, it doesn't mean that everything will fall into place, because there's an enormous amount of power standing up against that. And our job as a movement is to build our capacities and our power and to dismantle those of the few. And the media is clearly somewhere, you know, an area that works predominantly for the few, not the many, and is one that holds us back in transforming other areas, and so should be one of the central pillars for things that we transform. But, you know, we do it connected to how we transform everything else. It's about building our capacities as a movement to act in every sphere and to communicate with each other and to communicate with, you know, our neighbours and our colleagues and you know, teachers at our kids' schools and parents at our kids' schools and everything else.
Thanks for that, James. Finally, to Helen, why should we be optimistic on this issue, and how can we make it happen? How can we improve things in these across the media?
I think what all the other speakers have said is really important. We are at a moment where we can challenge it. Quite clearly, people are looking for their news from alternative sectors. They're not going to the Daily Mail and thinking that what they read is the truth, or in the Sun or things like that. And I think that is recognised. If you look at that report that I put in from Reuters into the chat, it's really interesting the way it talks about a drop-off in credibility from people. But the thing I would say is that regardless of what happens with the media or who owns it, we've got to continue to tell our story. You know, one of the things that is really important is that if you're campaigning in a local area, you need to knock the doors and speak to people, because their lived experience doesn't match what they're being told. And you can challenge it and you can talk to people. I mean, you know, our candidate was a woman called Faiza Shaheen, who's fantastic person. And we were very, very lucky to have such a massive lot of people come down to help us. But, you know, we had a 76% contact rate in the constituency in the general election, which was, you know, we knocked on the doors of 76% of voters and talked to them about why they should vote for her. And I think that's why we reduced Ian Duncan Smith's majority. We halved it, despite the fact that there was a swing against Labour nationally. You need to keep talking to people about what they know is right, and you know, win it on the doorstep, I think, as well as going for the fundamental change, but not waiting for it. Because, you know, our communities can't afford to wait for it.
Thanks very much, Helen, for that rousing finale. And it is in our own hands at the end of the day. And just on that very point, I've got a few thank yous to say before we basically close tonight's meeting. The first one is to thank, obviously, all of our speakers, Natalie, Tom, Helen and James. Thank you very much for your insights. There's a lot of links that have been put into the chat. Thanks to everybody who's put the links in the chat. We'll try and extract those and do an email of people who attended and who registered for tonight, so that we can actually share some of those excellent sources of information to everyone going forward. And also would like to thank our political education officer, Jane Hedges, for organising tonight's event. Big thanks to Jane. Thanks to Emma Heenan in the background, our fundraiser, and also to Calvin, who's been twiddling the knobs and sorting the Zoomery out in the background as well. So thanks very much to him. But a big thank you as well to everybody who attended this evening. We know we had people here from different parts of the country. You're very welcome. I hope you go away a little bit more enlightened than when you entered the meeting this evening. And just to finish off on one point, and it comes back to what Helen just said, you know, we do need to knock on people's doors or virtually canvass them, because that's all we can do at the moment. And we've got a lot of phone banking sessions arranged across the constituency in the run up to the local election. So please try and take part in those, but also as well, do, as all of our speakers have said tonight, educate yourself on these issues, but keep fighting as well. Do not accept the media for what it is or to be an inevitable part of disinformation. We've got to actually fight back against it, and we've also got to organise to get a better media as well. So do get involved in the likes of the Media Reform Coalition. Make sure that you do watch those excellent sources of alternative media that are out there and are freely and publicly available, but also support these organisations with hard cash if you actually can, because that's the best way that we can actually build up a force, I would say, for righteousness and for socialist ideas as well. So thanks to everybody for this evening. We hope to see you again on one of our webinars in the near future. And it just remains for me, Andy Walker, to say thanks very much and good night, and just wave goodbye, everybody. Thanks very much. Thanks, guys. Thank you.
We both love steak. Our favourite thing is to have it with garlic. That's my go. You mean that?